This is a special Unholy update. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
An unprecedented moment in Israel's history. Netanyahu's decision to dismiss the head of Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, Ronen Bar. Never in 77 years of Israel's existence has any head of the country decided to fire the country's domestic intelligence service. So this is a watershed moment, and we want to talk about it. The interesting thing is, we should tell our listeners, it hadn't yet happened because Netanyahu said that this is his intent. He wants to fire Ronen Bar. We will explain further down in this episode why it is a difficult thing to do legally, and he still needs to obviously get the authorization of his government. But that is his intent, and on the intent itself, we need to explain why this is such a dramatic thing. Besides unprecedented, this hasn't happened. What is in the background of all this?
Yeah, I think a huge deal. I think one good way of explaining it to people perhaps is that this is reopening a lot of the divisions that were so, ripped the country apart in the period of the judicial upheaval, the judicial coup back in sort of 2023. Those divisions reopened, and lots of very usually calm and level-headed people saying we're now into a battle for the soul of Israel, Israeli democracy itself on the line. So yes, this, it's not just a sort of personnel shift within the intelligence community. This is a very, very big moment.
Yeah, I think that many people in Israel feel this morning that this country is in an all bets are off mode. To understand where we are, I think it's really important to sort of backtrack and first say what the Shin Bet is. As I said, it's Israel's internal security service. And when it stands next to the Mossad and Amman is military intelligence, these three intelligence agencies are the sort of backbone of Israel's security echelon. The Shin Bet is primarily dealing with counterterrorism, uncovering espionage against Israel, and this is really important because it has a unique role among other democracies. The Shin Bet also has a role to protect Israel's democratic institutions. We should say that the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, is tainted by October 7th. Most Israelis think he should resign. He actually said he would resign. But the lingering question is whether the man who is also tainted by October 7th and is the last man standing almost, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu, should be the one to appoint his replacement. Remember, this is an institution that has its role in upholding the democratic institutions in this country. And what former head of Shin Bet, Nadav Argaman, said to me in an interview only last week, he said, I am really concerned that the government is pulling Israel towards a non-democratic area, and anyone who understands the power of the internal security service understands what the tools are at the disposal of anyone who would want to increase their power and influence. So that is the feeling that many people in Israel have when you consider the immense power of the Shin Bet. And if you are one of those people who think that Netanyahu is pulling the country in the territory of the undemocratic, then you should be very concerned if he is the person who will appoint his replacement. By the way, Netanyahu could assuage all these fears and say, yes, Ronen Bar is tainted by October 7th. I will appoint his replacement, i.e. one of his deputies. That has long been the custom, to appoint as the next head of the Shin Bet, one of the deputies of the current one, and that thus assuage all of these fears and say the continuation of the organization, etc. He's not doing that, which does raise these fears that what he actually wants is someone loyal to him at the head of this very important institution.
Yes. I mean, firstly, of course, he didn't say or mention October 7th as a ground for the dismissal of Ronen Bar, culpability for October 7th. Were he to do that, he would open the door to questions about himself. People would say, if we're now in the business of getting rid of anyone who is tainted by blame, culpability for October 7th, then, Mr. Prime Minister, where are you in this? And remember, he is the one person who so far has not taken any responsibility for what happened on October 7th. Also, one of the differences between them is over this question, as I think you mentioned, which is this issue of a state commission of inquiry. Ronen Bar was in favor of one and has said there should be one. And Netanyahu has held constantly, firmly against there being one, against all precedent, by the way. At the big moments of Israel's history, of its relations with its neighbors, whether it is, crucially, the Yom Kippur War, other examples, there's always been a commission of inquiry and set up very quickly, not this time. And you see that one by one, those people who've put their hands up and admitted some blame for Israel being exposed on October 7th are out. Meanwhile, the one who has not admitted any culpability is still there. So that's, I think, part of this story.
Let's just give that list to our listeners, right? We should remind our listeners that Netanyahu fired the man who was Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. He showed the door to the chief of staff of the military, Herzi Halevi, and made it really impossible for him to continue now with this attempt to oust Ronen Bar. And of course, there are many officers inside the military already taking responsibility, head of the Southern Command, head of military intelligence. So yes, it's a long list of people, and Netanyahu is not one of them, as you mentioned. I think that we should also talk about what is dubbed Qatargate, because this complicates issues further. The Shin Bet has been investigating Netanyahu's closest advisors. The allegations are whether or not they had connections with Qatar, so we should sort of go a little bit into the weeds of what this means. Did the people closest to the prime minister during a war when Qatar is one of the funders of Hamas also work for that country? It's a very big question. It's an investigation that has been going on, and it was considered to be kind of a fact that you cannot fire the head of Shin Bet as long as this investigation is going on. In fact, the Attorney General, Gali Baharav Miara, in parentheses, also someone that Netanyahu is trying to get rid of, informed the prime minister yesterday that he cannot fire the head of Shin Bet. It should be delayed. She says this, due to the exceptional sensitivity of the matter, its precedent, and the concern the process is tainted by illegality and conflict of interest, bearing in mind the role of Shin Bet director is not only a position of personal trust to the prime minister. So she is giving Netanyahu a red light. And as I said, everyone here is climbing on the tallest trees possible. There is no ladder in sight, and that is where we are. All kinds of things can happen. The High Court of Justice can say this is illegal and you can't fire the head of the Internal Security Service. What then happens? Does the High Court of Justice, there's an option here. It's a very far remote option that there will be a decision about the incapacitation law when it comes to Netanyahu. Like, we are in uncharted territory. And I know that we have said this a lot over the year and a half. There have been these moments. This is really a moment to sort of take breath and think of kind of where we are in this point in time.
100%. So just a footnote on the Qatar point. Obviously, Qatargate is its particular scandal. We've talked about it on the podcast. You do know that if this was the other way around, the right would be crying treason about this. That's how serious that is. And there is the suggestion that it was maybe not just Netanyahu's orbit, but did Ronen Bar know things that would have taken it even closer to the man at the center? Second point related to Qatar. In Ronen Bar's report, or the report that the Shin Bet published into its own failures on October the 7th, one of the points made there was about the history of receipt of funds from Qatar that went eventually to Hamas in Gaza, and Netanyahu, Prime Minister's own involvement in that process of in effect, building up Hamas, allowing them to receive money from Qatar, and Netanyahu's culpability for that. Again, so this was all uncomfortable for him. But here's the larger point I want to make, and partly to explain, I think, why people are so excised and see this as a decisive moment, a kind of moment of truth for Israel and for Israeli democracy. It may be useful to think about Donald Trump here. There's always this debate among people who sort of look at this, is Netanyahu rather Israel's Trump, or is it almost the other way around? Is Donald Trump, America's Netanyahu? Who was like this first? But the important point is where we are now and what Donald Trump is doing in his second term. Why people are so worried about American democracy is this stripping away of the guardrails, removing the checks, balances, restraints on his power, one by one. That is what people who are alarmed, many of them Republicans, by Donald Trump are warning about. I don't know whether Netanyahu has made this move because he's emboldened by watching Donald Trump get away with it there across the Atlantic, whether he is or not, this is a similar dynamic that's in play here, that piece by piece he is removing from the board those people. He uses the word trust. Really what he means is loyalty. He wants personal loyalists in this job. Now, just last week, Donald Trump was at the Department of Justice essentially announcing his plan to weaponize the investigative prosecutorial apparatus of the United States against his enemies. He didn't hide it. He more or less announced that's what he's doing. The power of the Shin Bet, comparable, obviously not the same, but comparable in this investigative sense to the FBI, in the hands of a loyalist. You know, Donald Trump has Kash Patel. We don't know who Netanyahu would like to put in that seat, but just consider how powerful a weapon that would be. Somebody who can pry into your communications, your records, know everything about you. Imagine the Prime Minister who is now on this path where he is and has been for a while of seeking to, you know, take out his enemies. Imagine a Prime Minister in that frame of mind, no longer with the independent institutions of the state holding him in check, but having all this power at his own personal disposal. I think just as people in America who believe in liberal democratic norms are concerned about Donald Trump, so people who have those same concerns, and this is not a left-right thing, it's a democracy thing, are exercised by what this move to remove Ronen Bar portends.
First of all, I think it's completely accurate, whether you're a Netanyahu supporter or opponent, that he feels emboldened by what he sees in the Trump administration and in Washington. I think that if you just turn the mirror around 180 degrees and ask yourself, what do the Netanyahu supporters see here? I would want to mention what they see here is that they think that Qatargate is a fabricated case. Its only purpose is to prevent Netanyahu from firing Ronen Bar. Many Israelis would point, even if they're not Netanyahu supporters, would point to Ronen Bar as one of the people, again, who are implicated by October 7th. This is the truth. In that way, tragically, he made Netanyahu's job easier for him. But in that regard, it's important to say that this is, the Netanyahu people will say Netanyahu is not to blame for October 7th. They didn't wake him. They didn't tell him what was going on. It is the security chiefs that take the blame. And here we are. We see them taking the blame one after the other and leaving or having to be, forcefully removed in a way from their role. So just an important note to make on what, I'm not saying half the country feel this way, but the Netanyahu supporters definitely do.
No, quite right. That is quite right. That is what the Netanyahu supporters would say, that this is just taking responsibility for what happened on October 7th. My point earlier was, in a way, the fact that Netanyahu himself does not mention that tells you that he knows he is in a glass house there and he cannot throw those stones. If he's saying we must remove everyone who has some culpability for October 7th, he's obviously going to lead to pressure or increase the pressure on himself to make that move. And it isn't really good enough. I don't think many people are buying the idea that, I know he wants us to believe this, that it was it's entirely on the military and security brass. It's nothing to do with me. They didn't wake me up. If you are the prime minister of the country, when the biggest, severest, most lethal attack on the country happens, on your watch, you are responsible. That's the nature of the job. The buck stops with you. And of course he wants to deflect that. And this is part of that. But I think this is one of those examples where the supporters may want to talk all about October 7th. The man himself, much more guarded about making that the heart of his case.
And the other thing you mentioned, which I think we should sort of emphasize, is the internal probe of the Shin Bet, which did what the military didn't do, and that is also point to decisions made by politicians, particularly that decision to transfer funds to Hamas from Qatar. It's not only in the internal probe of the Shin Bet, it was also in this interview that I did with Nadav Argaman. He said, we told Netanyahu, and we saw what he was doing. He was buying or trying to buy peace and quiet in Gaza with Qatari money. We told him that was a dangerous thing to do. We knew it would explode in our faces. He knew what that money obviously was meant to pay for salaries and for things like that, right, for humanitarian issues. But we knew where that money, or some of it, was transferred to, and he knew it too. And when you have people with that kind of testimony, it is very damning. In the same interview, we should say that he, Argaman put his foot in his mouth in a way and said, I have a lot of information that I know, and if I see there's danger to the state of Israel, I would tell that information, what I know about that prime minister. That, of course, helped this ball rolling down the hill. Netanyahu intended to fire Ronen Bar for a while. He was looking for the excuse, and he found it this week. His response to this interview by Argaman was not directed only to Argaman, but also to Ronen Bar. He said he's extorting him too. Everyone was asking themselves, why would you say that about the current head of Shin Bet? The reason was to prepare the groundwork for firing him. And of course, the question, as we said, very big question, will this legally pass? And will this pass with the Israeli public? Now, you're asking yourself about the Israeli opposition, I assume, so I can tell you that Benny Gantz was in the studio yesterday, and what he said is, I'm waiting to hear the voice of the Israeli public, which is an interesting thing to say when you're one of the leaders of the opposition. Maybe there
so I'm a leader
you
who
should be doing. Yes,
wants to follow.
But in any case, it is a question. There is already a protest day that has been declared on Wednesday, so we will see what that leads. As I said, if you ask the polls, most Israelis will say Ronen Bar needs to leave his post, and he indeed also said he will. That's not the issue. The issue is who gets to appoint his replacement and what kind of internal security service will then be put in place in the state of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, your interview with Nadav Argaman, really interesting, and you've explained the connection there, how Netanyahu used it in a way to add momentum to his campaign anyway to get Ronen Bar out. But it is extraordinary that that sentence of Argaman's to you, which is, if things don't go the right way, I've got dirt that I would release, essentially. There are things I can say, enabled Netanyahu straight away to go into attack mode and to accuse. And as I understand it, in the complaint he made to the police, he refers to the suspect Argaman as if Argaman himself is, an accused criminal, and the crime he's accused of is extortion. That this was a mafia-style threat, that do what I say or else, a kind of blackmail. That added momentum. It's so difficult. This is what I see being played out in the United States as well. It is so difficult when somebody is in a mind, when they are in a mood to tear away institutions and tear away norms. It is so difficult to challenge them, because if you do something like this, where I think Argaman's wording was really mistaken, but if you do that, then immediately they can go on the front foot and accuse you. And yet, if you don't say anything, then you just allow these guardrails to be torn down. And we're seeing the same thing going on in the United States. I think it's fascinating your point about the courts, because I'm sure the courts will side with the Attorney General and say, of course, this is a grotesque violation of the restraint that Netanyahu was meant to be under, which is where he was personally conflicted, where there was a conflict of interest. He was not meant to act. So here's Ronen Bar investigating his office. Automatically, Netanyahu should stay out of it and let the man do his job. Of course, he won't, because he wants to stop this investigation into Qatargate and put in some loyalist who will drop the whole investigation. Let's say the court say you shouldn't do this. Will he follow that? I just note that in the United States, there were various judges who said that people being deported from the United States should not be deported, for example, to El Salvador. Whoops, the administration deported them anyway. I think they're getting in a habit, these authoritarian leaders, Trump, Netanyahu, of ignoring courts and daring the courts to enforce their rulings. And I do wonder, if it becomes to a standoff, what would happen if the court tells Netanyahu he's not allowed to fire Ronen Bar? Will Netanyahu just shrug and go, "Well, try and stop me"? I think we're into that territory, constitutional crisis territory. But the missing piece, the dog that has not yet barked, the one that follower Gantz is waiting for, rather than leader, is from the Israeli public. I don't know. You'll tell me. My own sense, just even my visit there last month, is there's a degree of exhaustion in the Israeli public after everything that happened in 2023, with the protests coming out in huge numbers every week, then October 7th, then the longest war in Israel's history. How much strength and energy are people meant to have that they are now expected to go out onto the streets? It would be to me, a wonderful thing if they come out in similar numbers, hundreds of thousands, the way they did with the first firing of Yoav Gallant. But in a way, that happened immediately and spontaneously when people came out. So will they do the same thing again now? The fact they haven't done it the minute this was, leaked, suggests to me that perhaps people are just worn out by the last 3 years, and who can blame them? And therefore, will that be, will they not come out? And that will give Netanyahu the opportunity to say, well, I've got a free pass.
Look, there was it's not only exhaustion, although you are right about that, but there was a conscious decision by the protest movement, the group that led the protests against the judicial overhaul. There was a conscious decision to lay back a little, or to sort of retreat for two reasons. One, because they thought the main thing to protest was to bring back the hostages. That is the most urgent thing on the agenda. And the second thing was because of the war. They said, listen, the war's still going on. We can't politically, rise up and protest. I think that now that is a very different occasion. So again, we will wait and see what will be the voice of the protest movement, but this is definitely really a watershed moment for Israel, because it's a decision that is not like any other decision. A decision to move aside the head of the Shin Bet and to appoint someone in his place is a decision like no other, and it should be treated in the same way.
And we will be back to talk about the implications and the fallout, the reverberations as they go on all week, back with our regular episode when that drops on Friday.
We will.